All right, so I actually got this question about a month ago, and I'm so sorry it took so long. But as you can gather from the title, this is something I really wanted to get a little practice in before I showed you the settings. Because let me just read the question from Verd, and he says, "Can you please go through the time lapse intervalometer settings for the day to night time lapse on the OM-1?" So a few years ago, I did a video on how to do time lapse on the EM10 Mark II, and actually the settings are virtually identical here on the OM-1. And I probably could have cranked out a video like the next day, right? How to do time lapse setting on the OM1. But what made this particular question a little bit more difficult was he specifically said day to night time lapse photography. And this is what kind of tripped me up a little bit because there's so many other variables here that you have to consider that just showing you the same settings that I did in the last video really don't apply when you're doing day to night. So let me show you the clip that I made from that video a few years ago, and then we'll talk about the differences that day to night photography or time lapse photography would be. As I said, that was done with the EM10 Mark II, and I'll put a link down to that video so you can check it out because I go into detail about the settings that I use to coordinate me walking around that tree to create that final time lapse. It's a lot of fun to make, and I think it's worth a watch. And for this video, I'm going to do something similar except on the OM1, and I'm going to go quickly through the intervalometer settings because they're pretty straightforward. And then after I do the demo and create the time-lapse movie, what I want to do is talk about specifically doing day to night time-lapse photography because what's really different about that is you have to be very conscious of your exposure settings. And there's additional settings you have to make in the camera outside of the intervalometer menu so that you make sure you get the best image quality and the best exposure when you're doing day to night. So let's get started with sort of the short form version of doing the intervalometer settings in the OM1. All right, so let me do just a quick demo of doing a time-lapse movie, and I'm just going to use my Pen F here as a prop, so I'm just going to have it kind of come in and rotate around and then exit the frame. And for my exposure I'm just an aperture priority, as you can see over here, and these are the settings it gave me at f4.9, and I dialed in some negative exposure comp because it's a very high contrasty scene, because if I'm at like 0, the Pen F would be blown out. So I just dialed in -2, and let's go into the menu, and we'll turn the intervalometer on. And I've set up to take 30 frames. I'm going to wait 5 seconds for the first frame. I'm going to do 4 seconds in between each frame, and that'll give me time to move the camera. And then time priority, exposure smoothing on, time-lapse movie on. And then finally, I'm just going to do 4K, 5 frames per second. So that'll give me a 6-second movie, as you can see there. And now that I've turned the time-lapse on, or the intervalometer on, if you look in the top left corner, you'll see the time-lapse icon, and then the counter there says 30 frames. And that's going to count down as I'm as I'm running the intervalometer, I should say. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pre-focus first onto the camera like this. And then as I'm moving the camera, I'm going to try and keep it on the same focal plane. So let me put it into manual focus now that I have focus. And I'm using silent shutter, and metering is fine like this. And this doesn't matter. We can do raw, or as long as you have raw, you're in good shape here. And that's about it. Everything else is pretty much the same as you would do any kind of photography. So let me move this out of frame, and then we'll start the intervalometer by pushing the shutter button. And we'll wait for it to take the first picture, and then I'm going to move the camera into frame. Okay, and we're done. All right, let's play that movie back. So as you can see, it's pretty straightforward. You just have to give some thought to how many frames you're going to take, what your interval is going to be, and then what movie output do you want. And then based on those settings, uh, the camera will tell you how long it's going to take. So it took 2 minutes, and then it's going to create a 6-second video. Now, when you want to do day to night time lapse movies in camera, you have to take into consideration to a great extent your overall exposure, because that 30-second clip of me going around the tree, the exposure changed maybe plus or minus one stop. And that 6-second clip of the camera that I just did, exposure didn't change at all, right? Because I was using LED lighting. You can just put the camera in aperture priority, auto ISO, set your intervalometer settings, and push the shutter button, and you're good to go. The camera does all the work, right? But with day to night type photography, you have to get outside of the intervalometer settings and into the exposure menu and make additional settings there that will work with the settings that you use for the intervalometer. So it's not hard, but it requires a little bit more thought. And so let's go into the camera and I'll show you what I mean. All right, so I'm just holding the camera here over my desk because I want to illustrate, the exposure changes from day to night photography. So pointing into this light, we're getting a typical daytime exposure, 1/250th of a second, f4.9, ISO 200. However, as it transitions to nighttime, you can see that the shutter speed dropped to 1/30th of a second, and that's the lowest it's going to go. But the ISO is spiked now to 12,800. And this is going to give you very, very noisy images in the final time-lapse movie. And since we're on a tripod, we're doing time-lapse, right? So we're going to be on a tripod. I want the camera to use much longer shutter speeds, and that thereby keeping the ISO low so that we can get the cleanest and best image quality possible. And that's why we need to go outside of the intervalometer menu and into the exposure setting menu so that we can tell the camera, okay, use aperture priority, calculate the exposure for us, but use a slower shutter speed than what you're defaulting to here at 1/30th of a second. And that 1/30th of a second is based on the focal length of the lens. I think I'm at like 15 millimeters right now. But so let's go into the menu and I'll show you where you need to make changes so that as the camera's building or capturing the frames, it automatically can use longer shutter speeds. All right, let's go into shooting menu number 1 and go over here to page 3. And we want to change a couple of things here. Now, for the ISO range, I just set them to the maximum range available. I just do that out of habit, but it's never going to hit 102,000, so don't worry about it. This is where we need to make a specific change here. We're going to take the ISO auto lowest shutter speed out of auto and change it here down to 8 seconds. And I'll talk about why I chose 8 seconds in a minute. But let's change that to 8 seconds. And then we're going to go down here to noise reduction, and we're going to take this off of auto and just turn this off. And that's all we need to do here. So now when I go back to my keyboard, you can see we're at 2 seconds on the shutter now instead of like 1/30th, and we're at ISO 200, base ISO. So now we're going to get the maximum image quality out of this camera when it turns to night. And like I said, even if we point it back up here to the sun or the light, the shutter speed is just going to go to 1/500th, and we're going to stay at ISO 200. And then we go back, and it's only 2 seconds. And then as it gets darker, and I'll just put my hand in here, it'll go down to 8 seconds, and the ISO will spike up to 4,000, but it never gets pitch black, right? We're always going to have a little bit of light, something like this. All right, now let's go back to our intervalometer settings here. So we're going to go back to interval shooting. Let's turn this on. And we can set this to, say, 999 frames. because we're going to do an exposure for a couple of hours, not just a couple of minutes, right? And I'm going to set the start waiting time. I like to set this to 10 seconds just to give me a little pause before everything gets started. And this also helps minimize any shake or vibration from handling the camera when you're making all these settings. And then interval length, this has to be longer than the lowest or maximum shutter speed that we set. So I'm not going to set this to 8 seconds, right? Because the camera needs a little bit of time to write the uh, image to the memory card. I could do 9 seconds, but just for safety's sake, I like to do 10 seconds. They could give the camera plenty of time to do everything it needs when it finishes creating a frame in the intervalometer process. And then down here, we can leave this on time priority, and exposure smoothing, leave this on. Time-lapse movie, leave this on. And you can see now, if you look below, you can see that this particular process is going to take about 2 hours and 45 minutes, give or take. And that's, perfectly fine. I can get easily 3 to 3.5 hours out of a fully charged battery on my OM-1 when I'm doing intervalometer or time-lapse type stuff. If you're going to be doing anything longer than 3 hours, you definitely need to hook up a power bank or something to your camera so it can, endure that length of time. And then the movie that's going to be created is going to be 3 minutes and 19 seconds. But instead of doing 5 frames per second, I like to do 15 frames per second. And now look at the movie length. It's 1 minute. So these are the settings that I use for the most part for some of the examples I'm going to show you here. Now, just like we did in the 6-second clip of the PenF time lapse that I did, we want to frame the image and focus just like we would any other photograph. So what I'm going to do is just frame this image, just pretend frame, and then I'm going to pre-focus right here, and then I'm going to lock my focus in by changing it to manual focus. So now my focus and my framing is all set, and now I need to set the metering, okay? And what you want to do, go into the Super Control panel and change your metering to spot high. And you want to move your focus point, because this is where the spot metering is, right? It follows wherever your focus point is. Move it to the brightest part of the sky, not directly onto the sun, maybe near the sun, or maybe a highlight on a cloud. That's probably the best thing if you have clouds, spot meter on a highlight on the cloud, but you want to pick the brightest point. Now look at the histogram over there. You see that green area? That's telling me that I'm about 1 stop underexposed from where the highlights would start to clip. So that's what spot high does. It meters the scene up to the point of clipping, and then it subtracts 1 stop. So you'll never overexpose or clip your skies and highlights when you use spot high metering. And this will let you retain all of the details and colors in the clouds and things when you start to do your time lapse. And then as it starts to get darker, right? Since we changed our maximum shutter speed to 8 seconds, the shutter is going to go all the way to 8 seconds, and our ISO is going to go up as needed. But our sky will always be properly exposed, just 1 stop under where it starts to clip. All right, so I went into my backyard. I'm starting to have time to go to someplace epic, to get these beautiful landscapes or cityscapes. But just to illustrate, the technique, I'm doing everything I just showed you, but in my backyard. So this was about an hour before sunset, and I spot metered on one of the skies. And as you can see, we're starting in the daytime, and then as it goes into night, the sky maintains the proper exposure the entire time. Now, the next day I went into my backyard and it was very cloudy, but I did the same thing. I metered on the brightest point in the sky, but because it was cloudy, I decided to turn on the dramatic tone art filter while it was capturing the time lapse, and that art filter gets translated or converted directly into the time lapse movie, and I thought this came out really nice. Now all you need to do is just drag those clips into your favorite video editing software, add a little music, maybe a few pictures, and you can create something like this.